Welcome back to the program, and joining me in our Canberra studio now, and what is of course the final sitting week of the year, Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister Josh Frydenberg and the Shadow Justice Minister David Feeney. Thanks both for being here, gents.
Nice to be with you, Tom.
Very much.
Hi, David.
G'day.
Let's start on ADF pay. We know that they've got this offer, Josh, of an increase at 1.5%, albeit a real terms cut. We know all about that. There's a wage freeze, of course, on MPs, but when that ends, are we going to see what often happens and this big leap to make up for the years that you didn't get a pay increase?
Look, I don't think pay increases are on the cards for MPs, and in fact, as you say, they're frozen in the budget because we believe that everyone needs to tighten their belts. But when it comes to the ADF pay and the entitlements, the Prime Minister's made an important announcement today. He's taken soundings from some of our colleagues who have large numbers of Defence Force personnel in their electorates, like Ewan Jones and Natasha Griggs and Teresa Gambaro and others, as well as listening to the community, and we will be in touch with the Defence Remuneration Tribunal to make it very clear we want to see those entitlements restored.
A very small amount of money, $17 million. Apparently, according to some reports, that was almost causing the most unrest. Was it disappointing? There must have been a lack of consultation about how much that 1 day of Christmas leave, potential 5 days of extra leave for people that are doing long hours constantly. Does it feel like a lack of consultation?
No, it doesn't. I mean, I think what has happened here is there was an announcement and a change reflecting the tight fiscal environment, and that's why it's a 1.5% increase as opposed to a higher increase, which has been sought by some. But after taking soundings, after having a closer look at the details, the Prime Minister's made this announcement, which I think is welcome and a sign of a positive development after some initial criticism.
David Feeney, I'm going to go again to this analogy of politicians' pay versus that of the defence. Obviously, you've heard Josh Frydenberg say everyone needs to pull their weight. Under Labor in 2012, MPs lost some of their entitlements, but to make up for that, they got about a pay increase of 30%, about 50 grand for backbench MPs. It's a nice little earner. Is it a bad precedent to set?
Yeah, well, I don't think MP's salary is in the issues agenda for good reason, and that is that there's a pay freeze and that it's generally held across the Parliament that that's appropriate. The issue of the moment, of course, is ADF pay, and that's an appropriate focus for all of us. Today's announcement by the Prime Minister scrapes off half a barnacle. It restores that leave, but it doesn't restore the lost salary. And as you said yourself, the 1.5% pay offer is about 0.8% less than inflation, and that means at the end of 3 years, our defence men and women will have endured a real pay cut.
Now on that, Labor wants...
The Defence Minister has obviously been overruled this morning and has endured a fresh humiliation in the aftermath of his canoe remarks last week.
On the pay issue, Labor wants a pay rise of 3%, the previous one that the ADF got. But surely their pay can't increase in real terms every time round, and particularly with the budget in the shape that it is, the warnings we're getting about MyEFO, isn't this one of the times they may have to take a little bit less?
Well, I guess there's an argument we never heard the government make, is the first point I'd make. But the second point I'd make is that this was more of a wages strategy from the government than an individual case. What they were doing here is imposing a real cut in wages and conditions on the ADF workforce, knowing full well that that workforce, because of its unique obligations and the uniqueness of military service, is not able to contest wage offers made to it. It can't go on strike. Obviously, for the Australian Defence Forces, that would be mutiny rather than industrial action. And then using that essentially as a precedent to roll out across the public sector and into those wage negotiations.
Just finally on this topic, Josh Frydenberg, it seems like a pretty solid theory what David Feeney's talking about. Set the example of ADF pay, and then you can give lower increases to the public service. And I say that because Tony Abbott himself said no one's going to be getting as good a deal as Defence.
Well, the truth is David Feeney has a money tree that he only has and no one else has, because he keeps offering more money to everyone, like Bill Shorten, without understanding what is the true implication for the budget. And as Tony Abbott made very clear in his long press conference today, when you run budget deficits, as the Labor Party did, and you leave $667 billion worth of debt, there's a massively high interest bill. And that interest bill at $1 billion a month today, Tom, growing to $3 billion a month over the course of time, means that there's less money for teachers and for hospitals, less money for infrastructure projects, less money for our Defence Force and the equipment that they need. So Labor can't have it both ways. They can't, talk about fiscal responsibility and at the same time say say yes to everybody and be ignorant of the flow-on impacts of giving, a higher than expected pay increase to some areas of the workforce and the implications it has for other areas of the workforce.
Fly in the face of what we discovered today. What we've discovered today is that not only was the May budget unfair, not only did it invoke cruel cuts, not only has it opened up a storm of criticism, but most profoundly, we discovered today it's also a budget that doesn't add up. This is a budget that is in fact worsening our deficit rather than improving it.
Okay.
And this is a government that's borrowed $130 billion.
I'd love to debate those statistics.
I'm going to jump in because Josh Frydenberg mentioned the PM's news conference, and I'd like to play a little bit of it, a few snippets, if you like, of what Prime Minister Tony Abbott had to say in a news conference this morning earlier in Canberra.
I concede that the appearance last week was a bit ragged, but in the end, nothing matters more than performance. I accept that what we're doing with the ABC is at odds with what I said immediately prior to the election. The point about the levy on higher incomes is that it'll apply to less than 3% of taxpayers. So, yes, you could say that that's not in compliance with our pre-election commitment. I think sensible governments are not only entitled but are indeed expected to change when the circumstances change.
Prime Minister Tony Abbott speaking this morning, Josh Frydenberg. It sounded a lot to me like a bit of a mea culpa, a clearing of the decks.
Well, there's no surprise that we did have a ragged week, and when the going gets tough, the tough get going, and I think Iron Man Tony is up to the challenge. And the point here is we still have a number of successes which we need to keep reminding the Australian public of what we've achieved, and the Prime Minister did that in his press conference, namely the carbon tax, the mining tax, the direct action, the infrastructure projects, and also stopping the boats. But there is still work to be done, and what the Prime Minister was saying was, Tom, that our budget position has deteriorated, and that is why we've had to take some of the measures that we have.
In terms of what Josh Frydenberg said there, David Feeney, we know that Labor is seizing on this report today by Deloitte Access Economics that in fact the budget is deteriorating. But that report also said that the budget's the only roadmap for structural repair. The opposition and minor parties have washed their hands of setting out detailed alternatives by populist posturing.
Well, I guess what we saw today was a Prime Minister that obviously is now trying to reboot his position in the aftermath of what was a pretty extraordinary weekend for the Liberal Party, our first-term government thrown out of office, and the lessons of that resonating right throughout the Liberal Party. I think what we've seen also since the May budget is that not only was this Abbott government in trouble because it was breaking a lot of promises, but perhaps even worse than that, it was then refusing to admit that it was breaking promises and then constantly being bogged down in the fact that it was not only breaking promises but in denial about it. So today the Prime Minister, in the aftermath of the Victorian election, is trying to confess, yes, I am breaking promises, but at least I now understand that I'm breaking promises.
Okay, so
is it too little too late?
Perhaps in your opinion the government's becoming what the government's becoming what Labor did in terms of getting bogged down in that area. What about
Except
Labor?
they have a lot more broken promises to live down.
What about Labor, though, perhaps becoming a lot like the previous opposition, saying no to a lot of things, full stop no, and dismissing also the significance perhaps of revenue write-downs, which is something that Wayne Swan spoke a lot about as well when he was Treasurer?
I think what Labor is going to do is offer a alternative government to the people of Australia in the lead up to the next election. And
when do the savings start coming out?
And we will deliver a policy package that is costed and that makes sense, and a policy package that is actually in touch with the real issues that Australians are concerned about. I don't think anyone, political pundits, let alone the government, would imagine that the opposition is going to be doing that at this moment in time.
Josh Frydenberg, I'm interested because the government's spoken a lot about wanting to repair the budget. Labor, minor parties help us pass our budget to help that happen. But even if that happens, according to what we're hearing about MyEFO, you'll still fall short. There's still a blowout. Iron ore prices being cited here. It looks as though you'll need to find more savings.
Well, sure, and that's the reality we find ourselves in, with iron ore prices down over 30% in just the last 5 months, and that really does hurt us, and that actually means that we need to recommit to this difficult process of budget repair. And it was interesting in that Deloitte's report that you mentioned, that Chris Richardson, with no partisan political axe to grind, said that only the government has the means to take us forward to repairing that budget situation.
Just very quickly, foreign aid, could that be on the table again?
Look, there's been some significant changes in the foreign aid budget in terms of the growth. It's still a $5 billion a year government spend.
$7.5 billion less over 4
But Julie Bishop has done very well to bring together DFAT and AusAid, the old AusAid, together into one department, and I'm sure there are savings to be found there too.
So you think further savings in foreign aid?
No, I'm saying that I think this is a very important area. Julie Bishop is just using that money in a more smarter way than our predecessors.
I want to get onto the Victorian election.
Sure.
Both Victorian MPs, obviously, albeit at a federal level. East-West link was a big issue in this election. Now, the Victorian government says it doesn't want to build it. It wants rail money instead, effectively. The PM himself said the election was a referendum on East-West link. The voters said no. And emails between senior government planners and the last government showed East-West link has an economic benefit of about $1.40 per dollar invested versus Melbourne Rail Tunnel $1.90. There's also no business case released so far for this. And against this backdrop, the Abbott government is saying, here's $3 billion for the road, use it or lose it.
Well, it's a very important project for our state. And the truth is that the East-West link was always more popular from polled Victorians than either the Napthine government or the opposition under Daniel Andrews. So we believe it should still go ahead. The $3 billion from federal government is just for that project. Bill Shorten himself, Tom, went out and publicly called for the East-West link when Sir Rod Ennington first called for submissions. It shouldn't be lost upon the Labor opposition that was the case. And of course there's the dark spectre of sovereign risk, which is now being introduced into Victoria because Daniel Andrews is going to rip up signed contracts.
Okay.
Now, in the upper house there are 40 seats. Up to 11 crossbenchers could be in the upper house. So Daniel Andrews may not have his way if he wants to pass legislation.
All right, we'll see. Depending on what happens, David Feeney, if the federal government decides to take away the money, compensation might be payable. There was a lot of debate about that down in the campaign. It's a pretty dangerous game of bluff, isn't it, for Daniel Andrews to say that he won't build it regardless? Should he build part of it, maybe?
Well, I think we've seen, firstly, the idea that you can sign contracts for the largest infrastructure project in the state's history 30 days out from a caretaker period and then try and handcuff the state and an incoming government to it, utterly discredited. And I think if the Napthine government had had the courage of its convictions to take it to the people rather than handcuff them to it, they might have gone into the election in a stronger position. I also think we've seen Tony Abbott's effort to say the $3 billion for Victoria is tied to this project, and in its absence Victoria will lose that money. That act of blackmail has been rejected by the voters. Daniel Andrews makes the very powerful point that Labor made very plain 30 days out from the caretaker period when this contract was entered into by the government, that it is not a project that's supported by Labor and not a project that would be supported by an incoming Labor government. That introduces fair warning into the equation, and I'm very confident we're going to see a commercial solution because Lend-Lease is not going to be interested in going down with the Napthine Abbott ship.
Very quickly, finally, another election promise of the Abbott government was that all Commonwealth-funded projects worth more than $100 million would undergo a cost-benefit analysis by Infrastructure Australia. The Abbott government signed this before that happened, didn't it?
No, there was proper cost-benefit analysis done. It was always a major priority project for...
But Infrastructure Australia, that wasn't completed when this...
Infrastructure Australia has better proposals that it supported more fulsomely, and even the Liberal Lord Mayor of Melbourne didn't support this project.
And even the Victorian Chamber of Commerce, Tom, has come out and called upon the Andrews government to reverse its decision on the East-West.
We don't break promises in the aftermath of an election, that's your trick.
I think all the risk is on with Daniel Andrews on this one.
On that note of strong disagreement, we'll end the show, but of course, Josh Frydenberg, David Feeney, thanks as ever for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, David.
Cheers, Josh.
We're now going to take you to the Chamber